Good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Andrier, and I'm the Executive Director and Chief Curator at the Museum of Contemporary African Diaspora Art in Brooklyn. I am so thankful for all of you joining us this morning for our first Thought Leadership event. And we still have some more folks coming in. This is so exciting. So I might go off script a little bit. I may go back onto script. But again, very thankful that all of you have joined us. We're excited to share the vision of the Arts Alliance of Africa and the Diaspora with all of you as we uplift one of our founding members today. The Arts Alliance of Africa and the Diaspora, AAAD, was born out of a growing need to expand the narrative of Africa and its diaspora, and to create a central resource, historical, social, professional, economic, and educational, that ensures the lasting legacy of our cultural institutions, the preservation of our work and our art, while directly benefiting Black communities around the world. Since then, our global network of Black artists, art leaders, and organizations has grown to create a sustainable ecosystem that affords us the space and the capacity to thrive, independently and as a collective. We do this by, one, acting as incubators to preserve art, historical and contemporary, made by Black creators, being a consistent resource to our communities. Hold on, letting some more folks in. Being a consistent resource to our communities through mutual aid, education, and service delivery, supporting the livability of artists, staff, and institutions to enable the viability and sustainability of our institutions and our sector, provide flexible and strategic support that strengthens the organizational capacity of our members. We advocate for more equitable policies and practices for Black cultural workers worldwide. We gather data about our communities and we work to craft the narrative of Africa and the diaspora on our own terms. We collaborate creatively, share beyond our footprint, and support one another in times of crisis. We also enable professional development of emerging Black artists, curators, and leaders through skill sharing and standardizing best practices. We create a global infrastructure of support that is scalable and lives beyond our generation. So once again, thank you for joining us for our first event. I will pass the mic to Gigi, another founding member of AAAD.
Greetings. Hey, everybody. It is so wonderful that you have gathered with us early Thursday morning. So my name is Regine Romet. Most folks call me Gigi at this point. And before we dig in any further, I would love to share the organizations that have helped to ground us, right? Our founding organizations of Arts Alliance of Africa and the Diaspora, AAAD. So we have President Mokata. We have not present here today in this moment, but our grounding members are 32 Degrees East, Ugandan Arts from Uganda, African NEX, Nigeria and South Africa, or NEX, Black Artists Networks and Dialogue from Canada, Black Cultural Archives, United Kingdom, Foundation Dapper from France, Fondation MAM, Galerie MAM from Cameroon. As I've already stated, Mokata, we have Moasi, Oapok from France and Brazil. We have the New Local Space. We have Nubuke Foundation from Ghana, Sakile and Me from Germany, Social Impact Design Studios, Barbados, Kenya, and US. We have Wax Print Media from Ghana, and we have the Wawawa Diaspora Center, which was grounded in Benin, Haiti, and Togo, and the United States. So in the chat, you'll find a link to Arts Alliance African Diaspora, and feel free to join our mailing list if you're not already. And in this moment, I would like us just to ground ourselves and prepare for our very exciting presentation. I'm very excited, we all are, to have this thought leadership series starting with all of you today. The Thought Leadership is a new series presented by the Arts Alliance of Africa and the Diaspora that empowers Black arts practitioners worldwide through the lived experiences of dynamic thought leaders working with our sector, our culture, and our communities. Today's guest is AAAD founding member, Melissa Howell, who will talk more about her experiential learning project, the Diascope. Really excited to hear about this, which examines the alchemical design and practice of the African diaspora. Melissa has 22 years of experience as a systems strategist, working with a robust network of seers, thinkers, and doers across 40 countries in Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and the Americas. Through emergent, participatory, and human-centered program design and direct engagement, she has supported over 400 institutions, brands, and their leaders in forecasting paradigm shifts, building impact solutions, and organizing transformative collaborations across local communities. She is also the founder of the EdTech platform, GRP Think, or yes, GRP Think, Groupthink, thank you, dear, and Social Impact Design Studios. Please feel free to use the chat feature to comment, to question, to offer a comment, which we will include later in the Q&A portion of this conversation. Also, please, if you can at this moment, drop in the chat where you're hailing from. That would be so wonderful. We have quite an extensive list, and we'd love to know in which part of the diaspora we all are. And put your name and your organization also, please. So this event is recorded, as you noticed when you joined. If you're not comfortable with showing yourself, just remember that your name and the image on your screen are shared in this recorded conversation. And this recording will be shared after this event. So, welcome.
Welcome, everyone. Greetings. My name is Melissa Howell. I'm really excited to be here. Hopefully you can hear me well. I'm really grateful for all of the members of the Arts Alliance of Africa and the Diaspora, both for providing the space to share and also allowing me to kick off the series. We've been ideating, stretching. The space has helped me to kind of imagine and re-envision the Diascope. Perhaps some of you can relate, like I have basically two places where I park ideas and categorize things. One is this huge filing system that's in my head that, you know, requires a lot of time to get through. And then other places are domains. So I have a gang of domains where I'm like, oh, this will be a good idea. Let me park it there. So the Diascope really has lived as a domain for a long time, since 2010. And it, you know, was kind of a reminder to me to be able to bridge some of the academic work that I had done into kind of practical real world application, and also to hold me accountable to doing that. But it kind of got lost in the US recession 2008. And so I'm grateful to have this space to really to be able to share with you. Please be gentle and graceful. This is still very much in process and in progress, both the thinking and conceptualization of the Diascope, as well as what it looks like tangibly, and applying that to, like I said, real world application. But it is and has been super expansive. And the goal really is to kind of ground the ideas that support and surround the African diaspora. And when I say ground those ideas, I really believe that that the diaspora is less about geography and physicality and more about kind of this space that we encapsulate and that we are operating in, that helps to bridge our reality to our connections to traditions, cultures, practices, beliefs. And so the Diascope is a space that will allow for research, for thought, and knowledge development, and also production. And also a place to work out and flesh out ideas and ways that we're challenging our existence here. Some might call it messy. I'm going to call it free for now. So the presentation will be just some of the thinking that's gone into what the Diascope is and what it can be, and isn't fully fleshed out. And so I welcome your questions. I invite your questions, especially if any of these ideas are really still, too pie in the sky, and you're really curious about what that might look like in implementation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides with you. And thank you all for joining. The work of the Diascope really is to, like I said, allow for a deeper examination of these concepts that I believe support the idea of a diaspora. When I was growing up, I realized just how different and distinct my experiences were from everyone else's. And just a quick background, I was born in London. My parents are from the West Indies, Barbados and Guyana. And when we moved to the US, I was 3 years old. And I grew up in Miami, which at that time we lived for the most part in predominantly this really small neighborhood at the time that was called Kendall. And it existed kind of on the periphery of Miami. And what that meant was, for me, looking, just thinking back maybe like 10 at max 15 blocks west of us is what I believe was like the beginning of the Everglades. It was nothing but bush, grass, maybe some trees, but just like one long street that went out into nowhere. It also meant that at the periphery, we were composed of a lot of immigrant communities and populations. It was predominantly Cuban immigrant families that lived in Kendall. There were white families. There were increasingly more Haitian immigrant families, mixed income, mixed class, and oftentimes operating and kind of engaging with each other, but then also living and moving within our own spaces. And so to move to Miami, and particularly to Kendall at that time, was extremely dynamic. This was like early 1980s. And when we first moved to Miami, my mother from Guyana was introduced, or she was put in touch with other families from Guyana that were living there. These were individuals that we didn't know, but they still welcomed us and like invited us in as true family. So we kind of had like instant aunties and uncles and cousins. We also had a place to sleep. We had food to eat. We had shelter. And we also had advice and guidance that helped to shape some of the path that we went on. Personally, one of the things that I've learned and have come to know over time is that there's this significance that's placed on immigration, migration, and diaspora people of the need to assimilate. And this concept of assimilation is oftentimes attached to being a good immigrant. Personally, I feel like I've never fully assimilated. I feel like I've adapted. I feel like I've survived. And even though I came to the US at a relatively young age and still had a lot of time to develop my own kind of personal identity, I feel a lot of that was informed by my parents, of course, and then also these communities, these, my aunties and uncles and cousins, these Guyanese families that we grew up with and we came to know, as well as my friends that were from Cuban families, from Haitian families, and from white families in our neighborhood. So I still very much struggle with this idea of assimilation and whether it really is like the best approach for us to take. And I think it's important for us to learn about others and to constantly seek to understand customs and traditions and culture. I think it's also necessary for us to respect and honor and not kind of seek to overshadow what we also bring through our own personal identities. And so I want us, through this space of the Diascope, to really examine, like I said, this concept of the diaspora, but also of assimilation, and where in this exists kind of like choice and decision and voluntary practice. What I have seen and what I've experienced, and what I know to be true from my own personal experiences, despite multiple generations of African people who've been removed from the continent or have choose to leave the continent, there still exists this idea of resistance and even this sentiment of unbelonging that kind of persists across the diaspora. And I really want to dive into that and understand, what does that mean? What is informing and what's amplifying still this connectedness of people of African descent, both through this idea of resistance, through this sentiment of unbelonging, and also through connectedness and relationship to one another, and to the African continent. I really also want to look at what this means from a perspective to not solely have our identities imposed on us, but what do we choose? How do we decide to live? And what are the voluntary practices that we choose to engage in that make up our own diaspora experiences? I know that a lot of values and ideas about how life and society operate are based off of our upbringing, what we are learning and what we experience. But it also has a lot to do with who we're in discourse and conversation with on a regular basis, not only in our day-to-day, but whether we're traveling, whether we're working internationally, or working with people from other cultures and other communities. How do we feel, and how do we learn about ourselves, and how do we develop our identities on a daily basis? And what does that mean for this concept of the diaspora? I consider myself to be a truly global citizen, as I mentioned, not even just from my upbringing, but also from the opportunities that I've had to work and live in multiple countries. And so this composite of different identities is why the space of the Diascope exists. So when I talk about this experience of alchemy, I really am thinking about all of the things that we as people of the diaspora have been able to do and accomplish, and what does it mean for us to recognize and to know ourselves as a diaspora. So I really want to examine how we are designing on a daily basis the diaspora, because I feel like we have opportunities to learn about the diaspora from other perspectives. And I believe that the Diascope, this project and this space, can be our own, and think that it is healthy to examine how we're designing, how we're practicing, and how we're reimagining Africa's diaspora itself. I also believe that this manifests itself into kind of practical, useful tools, whether it's research, whether it's resources, whether it's productions, artistic productions, as well as curation of ideas. And I want it to be a space that's welcoming and inviting for other folks who may be new immigrants, or maybe generations removed from forced migration, including enslavement, asylum seekers, the quote, voluntary migration that, is a kind of a technical term, where individuals are choosing to leave their country for a number of reasons, but still that choice doesn't just doesn't start or end with that decision. So I think this space is really important, and believe that from observation and perceptions that there's really this large sense or sentiment of unbelonging, as I mentioned, that persists, and really want to search and seek out what this concept of home is for us as a diaspora, and really question how much we are defining our sense of belonging and our home based off of what's being imposed on us versus what our truest and strongest connections are, based off of not just our ability to survive, but also our ability to thrive. So one of the guiding questions is really that I've been looking at is how can we reimagine the African diaspora people, our identities and our sense of belonging? And what does belonging look like when it's detached from geography or physical land or rights that are given to us or ownership? What I'd like to share with you is a bit of how I've gotten from these concepts and these ideas of home and unbelonging, and some of the work that I'm envisioning for the Diascope going forward. One of these concepts is looking at the built environment. And as many of you know, this concept of the built environment is really kind of grounded in physical development and architecture and the design of spaces, of neighborhoods, of cities, of buildings themselves, of communities, but from a very physical and tangible place. But through the Diascope, I'd like to look at this concept of the built environment in terms of the space that we create. I think this kind of is a time where there's a lot of metaphysical conversation, and I definitely believe that we are spiritual people. And so when I think about the connections and the relationships that we have as a diaspora, I want us to also look into what that means to be connected to others from this spatial experience. So what is this space that's connecting me with Ngozi that doesn't necessarily have to do with our citizenship or has to do with the fact that we are living in the same city, but what is this connection, and how can we look beyond the physicality of the built environment and into what we're creating for ourselves as a diaspora? Just for example's sake, some of the conditions that I think are important to name and that affect a lot of us on a regular basis, whether it's daily or hourly or what have you, looking at discrimination around the world. I've personally, one just kind of anecdote, I lived in Spain for a couple years, and I was really shocked. I had this experience in the neighborhood that I was living in. There was a houseless person who lived on the same corner for the couple of years that I lived there in Spain, but still felt very convicted and confident in being verbally abusive and discriminatory towards me. And so whatever flaws there are in that argument about, feeling on, that we're on different sides and different ends of this spectrum, I really was shocked and questioned, what was this conviction that someone felt, whether in their understanding or their lack of understanding of who I was and the community that I represented, and how that person could choose to be discriminatory towards me. And so, I think that this memory that we have, or that I have, continues to play out in the work that I do, and the way that I show up. And I think it's important and it's worthwhile really examining how our memories, how our experiences, and how our connections are showing up on a day-to-day basis and constantly forming and supporting us as a diaspora. I believe outside of there being like a huge epiphany or revelation or awakening of the masses to understand one another, that there are things that people are doing right now today that are not just about survival, but are about this connection to places and to spaces and to individuals and communities that do feel like home, that are gaining ground in our feeling of belonging, that are worth examining and even extracting ideas and knowledge from. And so one of the areas that we're looking at now, and so I'm speaking expansive we, because this project is about the diaspora, includes the diaspora and also partners and collaborators. And so one of the areas that we're looking at right now is this movement of communities, this movement of Black women and these communities that are forming of Black women and developing all around the world, particularly those who are leaving the US and leaving the UK. And they're creating their own kind of enclaves. When I was studying at SOAS at the University of London in their system, like I really thought a lot about these ethnic enclaves and whether these were, kind of quote, good or bad places, but good in terms of like effectiveness or bad in terms of kind of counterproductive spaces for immigrant people. And, what does it mean to be a part of an ethnic enclave, and how does that support your ability to collaborate, your ability to thrive as an individual who's in a new country, who's experiencing new things on a daily basis? And how have these ethnic enclaves also supported this idea, whether positive or negative, of immigration? And how does it challenge the ideas of immigration and assimilation? So I really, am curious, like, what does it mean when Black women are leaving this country en masse? There's been this kind of movement or this saying, like, trust Black women. So I'm like, so then my thought is, as these communities of Black women, as communities of Black women are forming in Ghana, in Nigeria, in the Gambia, in Brazil, in Costa Rica, in Panama, in multiple countries around the world, are we still trusting Black women, or are we only trusting Black women when they're within, the society and the construct that we're comfortable in? Are we believing Black women when they move, when we see them move, and are we listening to them and seeing this movement as a cry or a celebration? What can we do to really question what's happening and to learn from this movement and to learn from the development of these new communities? How can we also, how are also these women and these communities being supported? Because these are going to be kind of the next wave. This is kind of the current wave of immigration. And I tend to believe that, having been in the US for a long time and also in the UK, like, when we're looking at immigration from a Western perspective, we're only really conceptualizing what it means when people are coming here. And I really want to question and understand and celebrate also what it means when people are moving away. And how can we learn from that? And how do we provide a space within the Diascope to do that? So from a sense of process, again, still very early, but wanted to share with you some of the questions that we're wrestling with and that we're looking at, and that still kind of hone in on this importance and this sense of belonging and the necessity to find home and identity. When we bring this kind of back to the Arts Alliance of Africa and the Diaspora and the work that we're doing there, I've come to understand art in many forms, and I'm grateful for that, because I was one of those children who thought and believed at a younger age that art was something that needed to be perfected. And so always really shied away from pursuing things that I either, didn't feel like I could do well or do right. And so, really want this space of the Diascope to also celebrate artists, art leaders, and be a support to artist development. One, not only because, the reality is that creativity is everywhere and in every instance, but also because the role that artists, art leaders, art professionals play is so important and significant to how we understand ourselves as individuals and also our society. And so I'm curious to think about how art leaders and artists are bringing this concept of unbelonging into their artistic practice, into their design, into their spaces, and to understand this search for belonging and home, and whether it is supporting artists and how can it support artist development. I really believe that like this space of migration and this space of artistic conception and development are very similar. They're both creative spaces. And is there a way that we can learn from that? Oh, sorry. Also, is there a bridge that we can also make in order to take what is happening within artist spaces and with artists and really translate that to other industries? I believe that the role, one of the roles that artists play, like I mentioned, has been to really help us understand just our environment and life in general, as well as society, as well as policy, research, identity, etc. But what are we doing in these other industries that can and could be supportive of artists and art development? Are there other industries, whether it's design or manufacturing industries, or whether it's work that's done in philanthropy, where a lot of my work has been as well, that's not just about financing or funding, but is also about understanding that if we are to learn from artists, we should also be contributing to and supporting them as individuals and their practice. So are we preparing and developing knowledge and research, not just for the mass or society, but also specifically for artistic practice? Is there a bridge that we can develop there? As well as, are there other ways that we can and should be learning from artists that can help to better shape the society that we live in? What I don't know is whether this happens outside of the art space, right? I know about the critiques. I know about, the examination and the celebration of art as a practice, sometimes as a commodity. But I really question how much we learn from art outside of it being an accessory to other parts of life and other parts of society. So what does that cycle of learning and understanding and knowledge look like? How can we bring greater clarity, research, information, and ideas to artists for them, for their development of their work, and to support the formation of what they're doing? And so for my last 5 minutes, I do want to share a couple of things in addition to this examination of Black women communities, in addition to this thought around supporting artists and art development. I've also been wrestling with this idea of ley lines, really thinking about kind of this space that the diaspora occupies, and whether there's this connection of ley lines to our some really core concepts. The way that I've been introduced and have come to understand ley lines is that there is like this intangible or non-tangible connection to different geographical spaces throughout the world. So, if you, some of it is considered to be energetic. So there are places, of course, like in Kemet in Egypt, in Arizona, in California, that are supposed to have that have kind of like this energetic pull to them. And so there's these connections, these ley lines, that if you look on a two-dimensional map, you can kind of draw some curvature curvy lines that connect these, these spaces, these cities, and these places. And I believe that there are also places that are calling us as Black people to them. So I want to investigate that. And, what might it be to really draw the connections? Why, again, why are these communities of Black women forming in these particular cities and in these particular communities? What's drawing them there? Is it these concepts of home, of belonging, of identity? Or are there other concepts that are really, that are also supporting these connections and relationships to these places? I've been working with a friend who is a new collaborator for me. Her name's Jamaica Gilmer. She's an amazing photographer out of North Carolina. And we've had, a series of conversations just about the work that we're doing independent of each other, but then also how this work or how our work might be able to connect in some ways. So thanks, Jamaica, for being here. And so, in our earliest conversations of exploration, I shared with her some of the concepts that I was wrestling with at the time. And so I want to leave these concepts with you also in this conversation. And so these concepts are justice, they're repair, liberation, and play. So I believe where I currently sit and where a lot of us currently sit, it's kind of like in this ebb and flow. I know that whether I'm doing direct justice work, that this concept of justice and fairness, of equity shows up in my everyday, whether it's, I'm driving and someone cuts me off, to, whether I'm getting a fair price, it's all of these different, ways that justice shows up, that repair shows up, and that liberation and play show up. And so I think it's important to translate our work. And when I say our work, I'm also thinking about our meaning and our purpose here on the earth as work. And so how do we translate these really heavy or seemingly heavy concepts of justice, of seeking justice, seeking repair, seeking liberation for what we are experiencing on a daily basis or have experienced over, decades and centuries of time? And how do we move away from this heaviness of work into a space of play? How do we really live that theme of joy being resistance? How do we really live this theme and move these ideas of justice, repair, and liberation away from the heaviness into a space of production, performance, activation, and also play? And how are we doing that in communities and newly forming African diasporic communities around the world? What are the things that you're doing as well to develop a sense of justice, a sentiment of repair, and a feeling of liberation? And so I want to thank you all for being here. I really hope that something that I've shared has either sparked a thought or an idea, definitely a sense of hope and home. I'd love to talk to you about some of these concepts. Like I said, I invite questions, definitely collaboration. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about developing relationships or partnerships around building this space that's a Diascope. If I'm to leave you with anything, I want to leave you with just 2 questions, just to carry you throughout the day. If you were to look at your life, do you feel at home? And do you feel like you belong? Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Melissa. That was really great. We're now entering the question and answer period. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. You can also raise your hand, and this is meant to be interactive, so anyone can. This is my My niece is with me, just in case people are wondering. This is meant to be interactive, so please, if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, please do. And maybe you don't have a question, but maybe something resonated with you, and we'd love to know that. So if anybody has a comment or anything Melissa said really resonated, or they see how it's applicable in your work or in your daily life, please share that as well. And we can also, and Melissa did give us 2 guiding questions. So if anybody wants to, feel free to comment on those 2 guiding questions she gave us. Please do that as well. And don't be shy. Don't be shy. We definitely want to hear from people who are with us today. But maybe I can kick off. And so, Melissa, a lot of what you were saying like resonated with me, but then also I began to think of being from Nigeria, and that for me that's my center, that's where I view as home. But then this idea of diaspora, and I was just thinking about everything that's happening on the continent and around the world, and the fact that so many people are in migration right now and are in different places. Even within Africa, you'll have Nigerians who they may not be coming to the US or the UK, but they're going to Sudan, right? And everything that's now happening in Sudan, now they're trying to migrate elsewhere. So people are constantly in flux, and this idea of diaspora, whether voluntary movement or forced, is just happening constantly. And I'm wondering, like, how do you see that as it applies to your work? Because the movement of people now is so pressing and fluid. It just seems like people are moving everywhere and then having to move back and forth, right? People get to the border in America, then they get pushed back, and all of a sudden you're somewhere else and not the intended place you wanted to migrate to. So how do you think, I guess, maybe of place, because it's so fluid, like where is migration and what are people calling home, and how do you see that impacting your work?
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question, Ngozi. So I think that so much of this idea of migration and immigration, as I mentioned, really is conceptualized around geography and land and this physical space. It's, do you hold a passport? Can we guarantee you entry, or do we guarantee you entry into this space of land that we've carved out and put our name on? And if not, where do you live and where do you exist? And so part of the reason I kind of even shared like my own personal background is because one, being in a country that is not your birthplace, or is not a place that you might consider home, can leave you in this sense of unbelonging. And so how do you develop your sense of identity? How do you develop your sense of grounding and belonging if you're in between? So I think about this, this term liminality, and how we exist, how I've existed for so many years in between physical spaces, but have still needed to develop an identity. We challenge the development of identity to our work. Like, you're not just your work. You're not just these things you do. You're not just the money that you make or your ability to produce. And so who are we? So part of this work, and part of the work that I would like for us to do really is to give name and to give understanding to this in-between space, to this ability to move beyond what colonialism or industrialization has done in carving out different land. So how can I still exist, develop as the person that I envision the person I envision myself to be, the impact that I'm looking to make in the world, the things that I'm looking to do and add and contribute to society, to become a leader, to become a practitioner, to become a to produce, works or ideas and put things out there. How does that happen? Can we name that? Can we bring a level of understanding to that? Because migration is going to continue to increase, whether it's for economic reasons, whether it's for climate, environmental reasons, whether it's for safety, violence, conflict. And the concern that I hold is, what is that? What do we then become as a society and as a people? Can we form community even in the midst? Can we form community that we believe in, that we trust, and that we feel safe? And what are those concepts and those values of our experiences in life that can bring us into really developing community and developing ourselves and our identity outside of belonging to a city, a state, or a country? And so some of that work does look like research. It looks like interviewing and examining and profiling people who are in the midst of the migration experience, have these questions of where do I belong and why quote, don't I belong? And whether or not their values are placed solely on a documentation or developing a home versus, who we are as beings and as people. The work that, we're hoping to do with these communities of Black women includes interviewing them, understanding, what was your impetus or motivation for leaving, quote, leaving? Did you ever feel like you were at home? Do you feel like you're at home now? Like, what are the questions that you're wrestling with that you believe will help to kind of ground you in this new experience? How are you intentionally creating your identity where you are? And what does that mean in terms of contributing to the society that you're in, both home, host, and in between?
Thank you for that. We have two more questions. One's from Amy. She says, does the Diascope consider what does it mean for places receiving those migrating, especially on the continent? We've seen the effects of Year of the Return in a few countries, some good, some bad. How does the Diascope factor this in? And then we have another question. We have a follow-up question also. How do we push the concept further, just considering time? So if you can answer those two questions.
Okay. Yes, in terms of consideration of what it means for places that are receiving those who are migrating. Yeah, so one major question, one major thought that I've been having is, again, this question around like ethnic enclaves and communities of people who are intentionally grouping themselves around what's familiar, what feels comfortable, what's known, whether it's women from the US, women from the UK, women from other places who are also migrating. But particularly I think about those because we, one of the huge themes or kind of challenges that we look at in movement in the US is this idea of gentrification. And I really am like curious about what questions people are asking themselves as they're forming these enclaves and these communities in other parts of the world. How are you looking to understand, even before you decide to leave where you're from? How are you looking to understand the community that in, Ghana or in the Gambia or in Kenya that you're moving into, from not only just a perspective of, feels safer because all of our skin is Black, and so it's, it has to be a good thing. There's still our politics, there's still, our issues and concerns around class. There also are cultural practices and traditions that are less likely understood. And so how are those honored and respected just as much as your own experience? And how can you not perpetuate, this idea or concept of gentrification and kind of bringing your ideas and your values from a different country and kind of just like placing that burden of understanding and of acceptance on your host country or your host community. So yes, those questions will be asked and will be considered. What that understanding is yet to be seen. And so that's part of the research, part of the interview, the need to interview both the communities of people and the individuals that are moving, and as well as who's receiving them as on the other hand. And then lastly, this idea of trusting Black women, how do we push that further? Whew. Who asked this question? Gigi. How do we push this concept further? That's the question. That's a big burning question. You know, I've talked a lot about like this experience of Blackness because I have the perspective of being a Black woman in the US, in the UK, in other places that are not predominantly Black. And so I think there's something to be said about looking at Black women within different communities. And I think there definitely is a different concept of trust when it comes to Black women and belief in Black women. And when I think about where some of that sentiment comes from in the US, it does have a lot to do with, you know, looking at the potential of seeking and reaching justice, seeking and reaching equity and liberation. And so that the question of how to push that concept further, I don't have answers. I have that as a question, and really pose that and continue to keep that as part of a thread and a line of questioning throughout the work, particularly work that will be focused on Black women communities. And not all of it will be, but whether it does or doesn't, it's still a question that we need to ask, whether the work is focused particularly on Black women communities or encompasses, you know, all genders and all communities as well across the work of the diaspora and the work of the Diascope. So to be continued, I think that's a living question for us, and I want it to continue throughout the work that we're doing. So I want to thank everyone for joining us and for joining me. And as I mentioned, you know, this has been a lot of expansive thinking. It still requires a lot more grounding, a lot more application and implementation. And so I welcome your questions. I welcome your critique. I welcome, you know, your thoughts on things that still feel really heavy or kind of elusive. And also your invitations and interest to partner and collaborate, both in the thought process and development of some of these ideas, as well as the practical application and implementation of it. And thanks also to the Arts Alliance of Africa and the Diaspora for allowing me to kick off this thought leadership series, for the wonderful people that we've been in partnership and collaboration with over the last few years. And thanks to everyone for joining today.